In the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was at its bloodiest. The Grey Wolves of Admiral Karl Donit's U-boat fleet still prowled the cold waters of the North Atlantic with ruthless precision, slipping between convoys under cover of darkness, their periscopes slicing through moonlit waves like silent blades. For nearly 4 years, the Kriegsmarine submarine arm had been the terror of the seas, an invisible force capable of severing the vital supply lines that kept Britain alive. Merchant ships burned in the night as Allied sailors vanished beneath freezing waves, victims of a war fought in silence, steel, and sonar pings. The U-boats were more than machines of war, they were a symbol of German technical mastery and naval cunning. Every time a ship went down, a message echoed across the Atlantic: the hunters ruled the deep. Yet beneath the cold calm of the ocean's surface, change was coming, an invisible shift in power that would soon transform the hunter into the hunted. By early 1943, the Allies were desperate. The toll was unbearable, convoys from New York to Liverpool were being ripped apart, and in some months the shipping losses exceeded the rate of replacement. The Royal Navy, though experienced, struggled to coordinate its escorts over the vastness of the ocean, while the U-boats operated in coordinated wolf packs, attacking from multiple angles under the control of shore-based radio communications in occupied France. For the men of the convoys, it was a nightmare repeated every night, flares lighting up the sky, torpedoes streaking through black water, the thunder of explosions followed by screams fading into the endless dark. Britain's survival, and by extension the entire Allied war effort, hinged on one thing: defeating the U-boat menace. But traditional depth charges, those thunderous barrels of TNT hurled from destroyers, were proving increasingly ineffective. They depended on guesswork, dropping explosives where a sonar contact had last been detected, hoping the shockwaves would crush the submarine's hull. Yet the U-boats had grown wiser and faster. They could dive deeper, change direction, and slip away long before the charges exploded. Every failed attack meant another U-boat lived to hunt again. Inside the laboratories and workshops of the Allied scientific community, a new kind of warfare was being imagined, one where machines could think, listen, and seek out their prey without human guidance. It was in this crucible of desperation and innovation that the idea for an acoustic homing weapon was born. For years, engineers had experimented with torpedoes guided by radio waves, magnetic fields, and even primitive forms of sound detection, but nothing had worked under the crushing pressures and chaotic acoustics of the ocean. The sea was a maze of echoes and distortions. Even sonar pings could be bent and scattered by temperature layers, salinity, and depth. To create a torpedo that could listen for its target seemed impossible. But impossibility was no longer a luxury the Allies could afford. In late 1942, a secret program began within the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance and the National Defense Research Committee. Its goal: to design an underwater weapon that could detect and pursue the sound of a submarine's propellers, an underwater predator that could hunt on its own. They called it the Mark 24 mine, though it was no mine at all. The name was deliberately deceptive, a cover to mask its true nature from both spies and curious officers. In reality, it was an airdropped acoustic torpedo, compact, self-guiding, and terrifyingly intelligent for its time. Developed at Harvard University's Underwater Sound Laboratory in collaboration with Bell Telephone Laboratories and Western Electric, the project drew some of the brightest scientific minds of the war. Physicists, engineers, and naval officers worked side by side, translating the mysteries of underwater acoustics into circuitry and metal. At the heart of the weapon was its hydrophone array, a sensitive set of listening ears that could detect the rhythmic pulse of submarine propellers. Connected to a small analog computer and steering mechanism, the torpedo could adjust its fins in real time, homing in on the source of sound like a predator tracking the heartbeats of its prey. The prototype was only 7 feet long and weighed about 680 pounds, small enough to be carried under a patrol aircraft like the PBY Catalina or the B-24 Liberator. Unlike conventional torpedoes that relied on speed, the Mark 24 was deliberately slow, cruising at just 12 knots. Its designers knew that patience, not power, would be its greatest weapon. Once dropped into the water, it would glide silently for a few seconds, its sensors adjusting to the ambient noise of the sea, and then begin listening. The first faint hum of a submarine's screws would trigger its pursuit sequence, sending it curving through the depths, zigzagging toward its target with eerie precision. For the crew of any U-boat caught in its range, there would be no warning, no sonar ping, no visible wake, only the low growl of an electric motor growing closer until it was too late. In the laboratories, early tests were both exhilarating and terrifying. Scientists watched as the weapon demonstrated a degree of autonomy unseen in previous naval warfare. It could make its own corrections, adjust course, and maintain contact even when the submarine tried to outmaneuver it. Yet there were doubts. The ocean was unpredictable, and so were men under pressure. Could this delicate machine truly function amid the chaos of combat? The only way to know was to test it in real conditions, against a real submarine. That moment would come soon enough, and when it did, the results would send a shockwave through the German command structure. By the time the Mark 24 reached operational readiness in early 1943, the U-boat war was already reaching its turning point. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park were decrypting German Enigma communications, giving convoy escorts a crucial edge. Long-range patrol aircraft equipped with radar and lee lights were closing the mid-Atlantic gap, the one safe zone where submarines could surface without fear of detection. Yet the U-boat still struck with deadly effect. Commander Max Martin Teichert and his crew aboard U-456 were among the Kriegsmarine's elite, veterans who had survived dozens of patrols and sunk thousands of tons of Allied shipping. They believed their mastery of stealth made them untouchable. What they did not know was that the rules of the hunt had changed. The Mark 24 was secretly deployed in May 1943. Its existence was known to only a handful of Allied officers. Officially, the aircraft carrying it were still dropping mines. But those who watched the weapon in action understood its true purpose. On a cold May morning over the Norwegian Sea, a British Liberator of No. 86 Squadron sighted a German submarine running on the surface, U-456. The aircraft swooped in low, its engines roaring as the crew prepared to drop their strange new weapon. Below, the U-boat's lookouts shouted in alarm. Teichert ordered an emergency dive, confident that his crew could outmaneuver the incoming attack as they had done so many times before. But this time, the weapon that fell from the sky was not a conventional depth charge. It entered the water silently, its sensors coming alive in the cold Atlantic depths. Inside U-456, the hydrophone operator heard something strange, an unfamiliar hum, unlike any screw or engine they had encountered. It seemed to be moving, adjusting, listening. The noise grew louder, circling closer, like a heartbeat closing in. Panic rippled through the control room. The captain ordered evasive maneuvers, sharp turns, decoy noisemakers, anything to confuse the sound-tracking phantom. But the torpedo followed relentlessly, homing in on the mechanical rhythm of the submarine's propellers. Moments later, a violent explosion tore through the hull. The sea swallowed U-456 whole, taking 49 men into the abyss. For the first time in the war, a submarine had been hunted by sound. The Allies would never forget that day. The test had become proof. The Mark 24 was no longer an experiment, it was a revolution. Soon, air crews across the Atlantic would carry the weapon on routine patrols, and one by one, the wolf packs began to fall silent. What radar and depth charges could not accomplish through brute force, the acoustic torpedo achieved through intelligence and precision. The hunters of the deep were now haunted by invisible machines that could hear their every move. The balance of power in the Atlantic had shifted forever. The invention of the Mark 24 represented more than just a tactical breakthrough, it was a philosophical one. For centuries, naval combat had relied on the human eye, the sailor's intuition, and the captain's skill. Now, machines were beginning to think, to sense, to act with deadly independence. This was the dawn of guided warfare, the moment when technology became both weapon and hunter. The scientists who built FIDO could scarcely have imagined that their work would mark the beginning of a new age, one where the oceans would never again be silent. As the Mark 24, nicknamed FIDO in the dark jargon of Allied airmen, moved from prototype to production line in the spring and summer of 1943, its deployment precipitated consequences far greater than a raw count of ships sunk. It changed the psychological map of the underwater war, rewired submarine doctrine, and forced a desperate cascade of tactical improvisations that betrayed how quickly fear, once introduced, can spread through a fighting service. What began as a trickle of successful attacks by specially equipped long-range aircraft soon became a pattern that German U-boat captains could neither ignore nor comfortably explain away. The early months after FIDO's introduction were a study in escalation. Allied patrol aircraft that for years had hunted with radar, depth charges, and flares now carried a compact, autonomous hunter that required no further human direction once in the water. To a U-boat crew, the effect was profoundly disorienting. For the first time the ocean itself seemed to take an active and maleficent role in prosecution of the hunt. Men who had trained in steel discipline and the cold arithmetic of patrol logs now found themselves listening in the dark to sounds that could not be easily categorized, motor whines that altered pitch and bearing as if guided by the submarine's own control room, persistent humming that would close and then recede only to return, noises that could not be outrun by a deeper depth or a tighter turn. The most seasoned commanders, those who had run the gauntlet of the North Atlantic for years, began to report an unfamiliar emotion, dread that was neither the rational caution of a prudent skipper nor the adrenaline of combat, but a gnawing paralysis that infected men the moment they heard something that behaved like a seeker. This psychological blow, subtle, cumulative, and erosive, made itself evident in logbooks and radio reports long before it was visible in tonnage figures alone. Patrol reports described aborted attacks, early returns to base, hours of silent running, where crews powered down and clutched at the hope that stillness might blot out detection. Commanders who in the previous year had patrolled with reckless confidence now rationed their surface time and avoided long transits on the surface even in favorable weather. The sea's former anonymity, its capacity to cloak movement and mute sound, had been compromised. A submarine's very signature, the whine of its screws and the thrum of diesel and auxiliary machinery, now constituted a beacon that could be trailed like a scent. The tactical ramifications were immediate. Where doctrine previously emphasized aggressive contact and coordinated wolf pack attacks under radio direction, U-boat operations began to emphasize avoidance. Wolf pack concentration still occurred, but with a new understory of paranoia. Commanders were instructed to break off engagements earlier, to dive at the first sign of aircraft, and to accept the loss of an opportunity rather than risk being hunted by an invisible, persistent seeker. The result was a measurable decline in the ferocity of some patrols. U-boats that might once have closed on a convoy to deliver crippling blows instead took up positions at greater distance, hoping that a slower, less committed stalk would minimize the chance of drawing the attention of airborne ASW assets bristling with FIDO and radar. Technical countermeasures were improvised almost as soon as the reports filtered up the chain of command. The Germans, always quick to attempt a mechanical fix, tested a variety of decoys and alterations intended to spoil acoustic homing. Bold, an early form of chemical noisemaker that created a dense cloud of bubbles to mask or disrupt a torpedo's acoustic targeting, was pushed into the field in greater numbers, and captains were instructed in the deployment of noise-making devices designed to lure an acoustic torpedo away from the hull. These devices, however, had mixed results. They worked only under specific conditions. Bubble curtains dispersed quickly at certain depths and current regimes, and an acoustic seeker designed to home on propeller harmonics could, in some circumstances, discriminate between the broad smear of noise produced by a bold cloud and the more focused mechanical tones of a running submarine. Other mechanical fixes, alternating the pitch of screws, running at irregular revolutions per minute, or shutting down auxiliary motors to create deceptive acoustic signatures, had tactical utility but carried their own risk. Slowing or changing speed compromised a submarine's ability to evade depth charges and limited its maneuverability during an attack. Powering down diesel plants risked battery depletion and left a U-boat with limited options for long transits. In short, every attempt to mask sound involved trade-offs that a commander had to weigh in seconds before being asked to choose between survival and mission success. Beyond mechanical countermeasures, the strategic and operational doctrines of the Kriegsmarine adapted in ways that reveal how a single technological innovation can reverberate through an entire service. Radio transmissions, long a means of coordinating wolf pack attacks, were curtailed or scrambled more aggressively to avoid providing predictable windows of surfacing time that aircraft could exploit. Shore commanders altered the tempo of patrol rotations, sometimes shortening missions to reduce the chance of prolonged exposure to the expanding reach of Allied maritime patrols. Support networks ashore, intelligence, maintenance, and crew psychology, were strained. The loss of confident captains, those who had been both tacticians and symbols of esprit de corps, had an outsized effect on morale. As reports of FIDO attacks circulated, young and recently promoted commanders absorbed a lesson that older skippers learned the hard way: the ocean was no longer a neutral medium but a contested environment in which machines could now outlisten human senses. This intangible pressure, an uncertainty about whether any depth or maneuver could guarantee safety, led to conservative decision-making that reduced U-boat aggressiveness at precisely the moment when the Allies were sharpening their combined arms approach to anti-submarine warfare. The Allies were quick to exploit this emerging vulnerability in doctrine and morale. Aircrews, once regarded by many submarine men as merely troublesome nuisances, became the delivery mechanism for a new doctrine of attrition. Maritime patrol wings were reorganized to ensure patrol coverage overlapped in ways that maximized the chance of an airborne contact being able to prosecute a homing torpedo. Aircraft crews learned how best to position themselves to saturate a contact with both visual and acoustic threats. They practiced run-ins that forced a U-boat to dive into a shallow acoustic environment where a FIDO seeker would have a clearer bearing on the target, and they coordinated with escort vessels when possible so that surface ships could finish the hunt when a torpedo strike had damaged a submarine enough to be forced to the surface. Logistics were reworked as well. The production lines that turned out Mark 24 units increased output to satisfy the demand of widespread deployment. Spares and training modules were distributed to squadrons so that virtually every long-range Liberator, Sunderland, and Catalina could carry at least one or two of the weapons on a patrol. The result was not only a growth in the number of survivable engagements but a shrinking of the U-boat's safe space on the surface and in the upper layers of the ocean. The air gap, once a zone where U-boats could surface with impunity to recharge batteries and travel at greater speed, began to close. The human dimension, often underplayed in technical histories, was crucial. The sound of a motor closing in, described repeatedly in first-hand accounts, had a disorienting effect on men who had trained for controlled responses to depth charge attacks but who had little frame of reference for being pursued by an apparently sentient weapon. Submarine officers reported sleepless, heightened startle reactions, and an erosion of the calm that was essential for the precise work of submerged navigation and attack. When a human mind is forced repeatedly into a reactive posture, constantly breaking off attacks, constantly diving deeper, constantly listening, the result is decision fatigue that degrades performance. Some captains became hyper-cautious, failing to seize fleeting opportunities. Others swung to the opposite extreme, making riskier gambits in an effort to reassert control over an increasingly uncontrollable environment. Both tendencies cost lives and tonnage. The Kriegsmarine's intelligence apparatus tried to soften the blow by classifying the nature of the threat and controlling what crew members were told, but rumors slipped through. There is ample testimony from veterans, later interviews and post-war memoirs, that the mere possibility of acoustic homers being in the water was enough to cast a pall over an entire patrol line. Tactically, the presence of FIDO forced U-boats to adopt profile behaviors that, in aggregate, favored the Allies. The need to avoid detection encouraged greater submerged travel, which in turn reduced the U-boat's effective transit speed and operational range. As patrols shortened and patrol areas contracted, U-boats encountered fewer targets and had less opportunity to mass for coordinated attacks on convoys. The Allies, benefiting from improvements in signals intelligence and air coverage, exploited this by concentrating convoys in ways that forced U-boats into riskier intercept courses. Even when a U-boat was not directly attacked by an acoustic torpedo, the knowledge that any contact could produce such a weapon changed the calculus of commanders and convinced many to take less aggressive stances. In other words, FIDO's impact was not measured only in hulls broken apart beneath the waves but in opportunity costs that translated into fewer sinkings and increased convoy survivability. The interaction between technology and doctrine also produced an arms race dynamic under the sea. As Allies refined acoustic seekers to be less easily fooled by decoys and improved their acoustic discrimination, German engineers and tactics officers searched for innovations that might blunt the effect. Experiments with alternate propeller designs, modified hull forms to dampen acoustic signatures, and tactical formations that dispersed acoustic profiles were all pursued, sometimes in isolation and sometimes in concert. But innovation takes time and industrial capacity, and by mid-1943 the momentum in the Atlantic had decisively shifted. Allied air power, improved sonar and radar, escort carriers, and weapons like FIDO combined not as separate curiosities but as an integrated system of anti-submarine warfare that exploited the U-boat's one glaring vulnerability, the noise required to propel a heavy vessel through water. Perhaps the most tragic consequence of FIDO's introduction was the way it undermined the quiet professional culture that had sustained many submariners. Submarine service traditionally cultivated a stoic acceptance of danger, an emphasis on calculated risk, and a certain pride in surviving the unforgiving world of underwater combat. The acoustic homing torpedo disrupted that ethic by inserting a new variable, one that no amount of seamanship could fully control. Men who had survived by virtue of skill and discipline now found their fates increasingly dependent on the performance of machines not their own. This transfer of agency, away from human cunning and toward automated sensing, was profoundly unsettling and contributed to a drop in morale that was reflected in desertions, disciplinary problems, and a rise in casualty-shaping events that did not neatly fit the pre-existing models of naval attrition. In the theater of propaganda and strategic messaging, both sides recognized the import of this shift. Allied commanders, cautious about revealing too much, nonetheless used the knowledge of acoustic homers in targeted briefings to reassure convoy crews that new defenses existed. This bolstered merchantmen's willingness to sail and helped keep the lifelines open. The Germans, for their part, had to contend with the propaganda problem of acknowledging a weapon that could not easily be countered without admitting to a new fragility. Publicly, the Kriegsmarine tended to minimize the novelty, couching losses in euphemisms and focusing on valor. Privately, however, the tone was more urgent. Staff meetings that once concerned fuel and torpedo stocks now dealt with noise signatures, decoy deployment, and the psychological welfare of crews. By the close of 1943, the cumulative effect of FIDO and Allied ASW measures was clear in the cold calculus of tonnage and patrol success. U-boat effectiveness had waned, and commanders on both sides understood that the days of unfettered submarine hunting in the open Atlantic were over. Yet it would be a mistake to construe the Mark 24's impact as purely technological, it was equally a social and doctrinal phenomenon. It rewired choices, altered risk thresholds, and reframed how men and machines interacted beneath the waves. In so doing it helped tilt the Atlantic War away from the prowling, predatory model of the German U-boat and toward a combined, systematized Allied response that would, in the months to follow, make the ocean a far less hospitable hunting ground for the wolf packs. The terror that accompanied the knowledge of being pursued by sound was, in the end, as decisive as the torpedoes themselves, because once fear had entered the minds of commanders and crews, tactical daring and operational momentum withered, and the hunter became, with growing frequency, the hunted.